Hi, I'm Thom Gilligan, president and founder of Marathon Tours and Travel in 1979. And I'm also the creator of the Antarctica Marathon, which was first held in 1995. And during our virtual Antarctica Marathon and half marathon week, I thought I'd like to share a little bit about the history of the Antarctica Marathon and how it all got started. Because the first Antarctica Marathon was also the first sporting event ever held in Antarctica, whereby participants traveled from outside Antarctica to go there to compete in a running event. So back in August of 1993, I was featured on the cover of Travel Agent magazine, which is the largest trade journal in the travel industry. Usually the cover is reserved for CEOs of airlines or hotel chains or other dignitaries, but in this case, they were covering the new concept of tour operators and retail travel agencies specializes in market niches. Now, we had been doing this already for about 16 years, but they captured me on the cover of the publication. And in the feature article, I was very innocently quoted as saying, "We've had a trip to every continent except Antarctica." Little did I know that that single sentence was going to change my life and the lives of many of our clients. Within 2 days of the publication being on the street, I got a call from the owner of Marine Expeditions from Toronto, which specialized in polar expeditions. And he asked if I were interested in organizing a marathon in Antarctica. And of course, at first I thought, here's another crazy idea from someone who knows nothing about running. However, I was intrigued by the idea of having a running event in such a remote location. So I agreed to have a meeting, and we sat down to discuss the idea of traveling to Antarctica to try to find a location where we could hold a 42K running event and a 21K running event. Now, in the meantime, the Wall Street Journal picked up on the article, and they contacted me and gave 7 different interviews to create an article, which eventually landed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in December of 1993. And in that article, I took a little bit of a risk and said that we were going to have a marathon in Antarctica. I just knew the publicity would be unprecedented. And I was correct, because as soon as that article reached the street, we were getting calls from all over the world asking how they could send a deposit to reserve a spot. So now I knew we were onto something. And at that time, in the mid-1990s, there were not a lot of the exotic events that we now have. There was no Great Wall. There were none of the African safari marathons. So it was a little bit of a new concept to be going to these extreme locations. So in January of 1994, I went to Antarctica with Marine Expeditions, and the vice president of the company, Pat Shaw, accompanied us and enabled me to visit 3 locations in Antarctica to see if we could find a venue. The first place we visited was Arctowski, the Polish base on the far eastern end of King George Island, the largest of the South Shetland Islands, which are just off the Antarctic Peninsula. So I went there and I met with the base commander, and I ran up on a glacier behind the base to see if we could find a route where we could create a course. Unfortunately, the running conditions were not very good, and that was my first experience with the Antarctic brown skua, which are dive bombing birds that are quite large, and they're somewhere between a seagull and a hawk, but they're very aggressive. And I was all by myself running up on a glacier being attacked by skuas. So that wasn't a very pleasant experience, nor a pleasant introduction to life in Antarctica. The next venue we took a look at was on the western end of King George Island, on an area called the Fildes Peninsula, where there are 4 bases from Russia, Chile, China, and Uruguay. So we visited there, and I went ashore and ran on some of the roads that interconnect the bases. And I thought, this is very good running, great scenery. It would be fun to have some bases along the route where they could provide some services, and they could cheer on some of the runners, even though the bases are quite small. But I was intrigued there. However, I felt that we would have to deal with those 4 government agencies, and that the bureaucracy could get complicated. So we looked at a third venue down on the Antarctic Peninsula at an Argentine base called Esperanza, which is right at the tip of the peninsula in an area called Hope Bay. The scenery was absolutely spectacular. And the commander of the base was a skier and an athlete, and he was quite excited at the idea of perhaps having a marathon there. So he took me up to a glacial plain that had about a 10K loop, and he followed me around in his snowcat while I ran this loop. And his fear was there's lots of crevasses up there, and he just wanted to be sure that if I had any issues, he'd be there to save me. So I ran that loop looking at the scenery, the icebergs, and the other islands in around Hope Bay. Was absolutely spectacular. I'll never forget how blue the sky was. It was a sunny day, and I just visualized the idea of having a marathon there. And I thought, this is perfect. So I returned back to the States, and I contacted the Argentine Department of Tourism in the United States and mentioned to the director what we were hoping to do to see if we could partner with the Argentine government. So he contacted the Minister of Tourism in Buenos Aires, and they asked us if we could put together a brief proposal, which we did in partnership with Marine Expeditions. So they read that and they said, this is a pretty good idea, and it'll bring some tourism dollars to Argentina, since we would stay in Buenos Aires and also use Argentine Airlines to fly to Ushuaia and then board our ship, Ushuaia being the southernmost city in the world. But the Minister of Tourism said, we have to run this by the Minister of Finance so he can sign off on it. So we put together an economic impact study on how many tourism dollars it would bring in year to year, et cetera. And the Minister of Finance said, fine, we're good with it, but we have to run it by one more ministry, and that's the Ministry of the Interior, which controls Antarctic affairs. And at the time, Argentina was trying to become the custodian of Antarctic affairs, which all the Antarctica affairs are handled by the Antarctic Treaty Organization, Argentina being one of the signatories. But there was also a lot of controversy at the time because Argentina, Chile, and the UK all claimed territorial rights to a piece of pie that included the South Shetland Islands, including King George Island, and a part of the peninsula. No one recognizes those territorial claims, but there is a kind of gentleman's agreement to respect them and to go through certain protocols in order to use any of that area. So the Minister of the Interior was concerned about the pushback if they were to agree to partner with an organization putting on the first sporting event in the history of Antarctica. So all during this time, that was from January of 1994, was taken the entire year to get through this process. In the meantime, we were selling into the marathon. And we had chartered 2 ships, each holding 80 passengers, runners and supporters. And it was selling like wildfire. I was absolutely shocked since it was the most expensive, the most extreme. It was a 2-week trip and it was unprecedented. But people from all over the world were sending in deposits and we sold out quite easily all of the 160 spots. So as we were getting closer to the date, I was getting a little bit concerned that we were still tied down into this bureaucracy within Argentina, of which they are famous. So we were all signed, sealed, delivered as far as filling up the ships and having the charter arrangements and booking hotels and flights from Buenos Aires to Ushuaia. On December 23rd, I received a letter from the Director of Tourism in the United States after months and months and months of negotiation. And the letter simply said, "Dear Mr. Gilligan, we appreciate your wonderful idea. However, we cannot allow you to hold a marathon in our country." So they were referencing their territorial claims that Esperanza on the tip of the peninsula was their country and they would not allow a marathon to be held there for political reasons. So I contacted Marine Expeditions, and now I was really tearing out my hair. And at that time, I didn't have the white hair that I do now. I didn't have any gray hairs. But since then, of course, things have changed. And it was a harrowing experience to take all the risks of chartering these ships, planning the most extreme event we've ever been involved with, and the sport had been involved with. And now we're being told we can't have the marathon. So I asked Pat Shaw from Marine Expeditions, what are our options? And he said, well, we still have a backup plan, which we did at on the Fildes Peninsula on King George Island on the western end where the 4 bases were. But I said, well, how are we going to negotiate with those 4 countries when we only have 30 days left? People are ready to go. They've done all their training. We've been corresponding with them. And now here we are with no venue. He said, well, here's what we'll do. We have a ship pulling into the Russian base in about 2 weeks. I'll send the expedition leader in to meet with the commander of the base, mention the idea of having a marathon, and see how he responds. So I crossed my fingers, and 2 weeks later, we got a response back that said, there's no resistance to the idea. The Russians be happy to partner with us. And we just need to meet with the bases a few days before the event to explain exactly how we're going to conduct the event, how we're going to have no impact on the environment, which is required by all visitor regulations under IATO, the International Antarctic Association of Tour Operators. And so that's what we agreed to do. So in other words, we were heading to Antarctica with 2 shiploads of runners and supporters, not really knowing how we were going to pull this off. So, of course, we went through our process of visiting Buenos Aires, doing some training runs, having some briefings on visits to Antarctica. And the question was constantly asked, what's the cost like, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I didn't have a whole lot of answers. So I just kind of worked my way around having a direct answer and say, well, we're not going to know until we get there because we're meeting with the bases, et cetera, and we'll organize the course once we get there. Now, in those days, what we did was we dropped off myself and the organizing crew of 3 others, so a team of 4. We were dropped off in King George Island for 3 days. And then the ship would go down to the Antarctic Peninsula, do cruising among the whales, and doing all the visitor activities, zodiac cruising, landings on the islands and on the peninsula, and seeing some of the most incredible wildlife and scenery available on Earth. In the meantime, myself and my team were meeting with the bases to discuss a marathon and to try to design a course. The Uruguayans always described themselves as the small country with the big heart. And they asked if we could have the start and finish at their base. So that was very much a positive reaction to the marathon. And at the same time, we were actually staying at the Uruguayan base. They wanted to host us, so they were providing 3 meals a day. They had a helicopter. They brought a military helicopter because the base is controlled by the military. They brought us up in the helicopter, and we did an overview of the Fildes Peninsula. We could see the road systems there. And lo and behold, we came up with a 13.1 mile race, which started at the Uruguayan base, which is called Artigas, ran along a beach, ran about 1 mile up a glacier, down the backside, over to the other side of the island, looping around through the Russian base, the Chilean base, having the turnaround at the Chinese base, and then heading back to Artigas to give us 13.1 miles. You run that twice, and there's our marathon course. So we were absolutely delighted once we got to that point, knowing we had an absolutely fantastic course, despite all the bureaucracy and the politics. Those were put behind us once we get on shore, and once we met with all of the bases. They were very enthusiastic to have some type of activity to break up their mundane existence from day to day of just doing scientific work, and the marathon was a go. So the ships returned to King George Island. We had the first marathon and half marathon with about 130 runners. It was an absolute huge success. We had Bob Wishnia, who was a senior editor from Runner's World magazine, who ran in the marathon, wrote a feature article in Runner's World that reached runners from all over the globe. And there we were with huge amount of publicity, and the demand just zoomed from there. And another noted result of that was once the marathon was finished, that evening during our celebration, 4 runners mentioned, and they were unrelated to each other, that they had just completed their a marathon on all 7 continents. So they were the first runners to be able to claim they completed a marathon on all 7 continents. As soon as I heard that, a light bulb went on, and I thought, what a wonderful goal. And people around the bar who had heard about it said, I want to do that. So I said, fine, we'll start the 7 Continents Club, which we did. And soon thereafter, we had about 30 people who were on that trip, who all agreed to travel to Africa and to Europe and to South America, and eventually to New Zealand, where about 30 people finished their 7th continent at the Millennium Marathon, which was the first marathon of the new millennium, held on January 1st, 2000 in Hamilton, New Zealand. So that added about another 30 to the list. And so there we are. That's the initial history of both the Antarctica Marathon and also the start of the 7 Continents Club and the 7 Continents Challenge. So to start off our virtual Antarctica Marathon week, I thought it would be interesting to all of you who are participating, who have already run in Antarctica or who are now booked to join us in 2022 or thereafter, to know a little bit more about the history of the event. So I thank all of you for participating in our virtual marathon. We will eventually have the real thing, but for now, we hope you have a fun week. I hope you put on some of your Antarctica Marathon gear, and I know that some of you are in extreme locations, hopefully with some snow and ice around you. And we'll look forward to getting some of your quotes, photos, videos, social media posts, and all the other activities that'll take place for the next week. Thank you all, and we hope to see you soon somewhere.